Welcome to Property Addicts Australia, your home for everything property investing. Get an insider's view of what really works when building a portfolio. Learn how to avoid the common mistakes, plus get all the tips and tricks from the property investing experts Sana and Mona Ali. Join us to learn from the experts and set yourself up for long-term success in property investing. Proudly powered by propertytwins.com.au.
We do not like off-the-plan or brand new properties, and there's good reasons for that.
So when we started our property journey, the New South Wales government had introduced this $24,000 grant for first home buyers. So this goes back to 2009. And it was quite attractive, right? So we went and put deposits, initial deposits, fortunately, with a cooling off, towards 2 off-the-plan apartments in Sydney.
In Western Sydney. And it felt good. They were shiny, brand new. They looked amazing, like something we could even live in or rent out to tenants.
That's right, because they were just about nearing completion. That was the saving grace in all of that, purely because many times people put deposits for off-the-plan properties, and these properties take years to build and they're not ready and they keep getting delayed. But fortunately for us, the properties were just about ready. That means the bank could go out and value these properties.
And they valued both of those properties short. So one of them was purchased for $365K and the bank valued them at $330K. So there was no clear visibility as to how we would complete that deal. Obviously, the bank wasn't going to fund the difference in them.
That's right. So just because the bank valued it at $330,000 and we were paying $365,000 for one of the 2 properties, we were like, well, if the bank doesn't agree with the valuation, why should we? So that it clearly means that we are overpaying for this property.
The interesting thing is the selling agent who appeared to be on our team. Obviously, we didn't know any concept of selling agent or buyer's agents. The selling agent appeared to be on our team, and he also told us the strata for the property will be only $300 or $400
a quarter,
which is like maybe $120 a month or so. And when we did our numbers, it looked pretty attractive, and both properties were in very high density complexes. And I actually got the number for the company which was going to register the strata plan to ask, hey, look, would the strata be $300 to $400? And the guy was really upset on the other side of the phone. And he said to me, how does the selling agent know that it will be $300 to $400? We haven't even determined the strata. And he indicated that the strata could run into $1,200 to $1,500 a quarter.
So $1,200 to $1,500 a quarter, if you do the sums, I've said even $1,200 divided by 3 months, that's $400 per month that you're paying just for strata costs. So you need to be very careful and include that in your budget if you are looking to buy something like that. But again, we are so grateful that the property was ready to be valued. We had the cooling off. And in that time, we decided to end the deal, pull out of the deal. We lost 0.25% of the deposit.
That's the standard in New South Wales. If you change mind or pull out of the deal for any reason, like valuation in this case. But it felt like a big lesson because, when you're a first-time property buyer, as a home buyer or a first-time investor, every dollar counts. And it was just the best price we paid, even though it stung at the time.
It was the best lesson that we learned in that moment. And we're just so glad that we did because that's what formed the foundation of our property journey and what we ended up doing and what we do today with our clients.
And what's really the guiding principle in how we do things with what type of properties we buy for our clients or suggest anybody who comes to us for advice as to what they should do. And time to time, we do run into people who might have unknowingly registered for that brand new property and not knowing the costs involved.
And in most instances where you do put a deposit down for a brand new property, you may not be fortunate enough to have a finance clause or a finance clause or a cooling off, because often these properties are months, if not years, until they'll be built. And the bank cannot value a property until you're close to completion.
So we were fortunate that we were able to get the valuation done and the banks say it can't be valued. And let me tell you, it's an extremely stressful period when you are in a cooling off, you're running against time, you're doing your strata checks, you're doing your building checks and finance. It's pretty stressful period. And lucky for us, within those 10 days, we could walk away from those deals. But we did end up buying better properties. So just up the road from one of the units.
That's right. So with this, so we did a comparison, right, of what we ended up purchasing, against what we pulled out from.
Yep.
So we ended up purchasing a property for approximately $330,000.
Just maybe a kilometer or so away from one of these brand new units.
With a bit of land component there. And we did an analysis.
So $330K purchase?
Yep, $330K purchase versus this $365,000 purchase or apartment that we would have bought. As of now, which is about nearly 15 years, the established property that we bought for $330,000 is now worth somewhere around $730,000. So it's about 121% gain over 15 years, or it works out to be 8% per annum.
Yep. And the unit, similar properties are now selling for $520K, which is about 43% capital growth in the same time frame, which is about less than 3% per annum growth. So you can see the difference of overpaying on a property versus an established property, which has grown way more.
And if you were to access this equity for the unit, if you access 80% of that gain, you could have about $124,000 available to you, subject to borrowing capacity, to be able to use that as a deposit for another property. Whereas for the established property, it's about $380,000 that you could access. The difference one makes versus the other is that with the $124,000, you could fund a $500K property, whereas from the $380,000, you could fund a $1.5 million property portfolio. So it's all compounding.
Yeah, so a $500K property grows 10%, you make $50,000, but a $1.5 mil property grows, you make $150K, and it's ever compounding and ever growing. So the starting point of your property journey is so important, where you're starting out. So because overpaying for a property which may not grow for a very long time or stay stagnant, you won't be able to progress. Because, we often have seen clients who've come to us post purchasing these properties, and they've, in many circumstances, purchased them at the peak of the market from someone who disguised to be working for them to help them build that portfolio. And maybe even 6-7 years later, the property's done nothing. There's been no growth. They have not been able to expand that portfolio, and they're stuck.
And that leads us to talking about how people say, if you are going and buying off the plan and you're buying it direct, say from developers, agents, or marketing professionals selling you these glossy, brand new properties, and you're not paying them a fee. Whereas if you have a buyer's agent involved who goes and buys your established property, you pay anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000 or more, depending on what market you're targeting. So people say, well, I don't have to pay a fee. It's a free service. Yeah. But if you look at the scenario that we just compared, a property that's only grown 43% versus a property that's grown 121%, you are actually paying a price for it long term.
It's built into the selling price. They have to do all this marketing. It's brand new. It's shiny. You're the one paying the seller's agents in it. And these commissions run into anywhere, $20,000, $30,000, tens of thousands of dollars, basically. And what we find interesting is we have at least one phone call a month from one of these developers who say, oh, we want to work with you and we want to help your clients buy our properties. And the conversation doesn't really go far because it just doesn't sit well with us to even promote any of that.
And we've been on this journey, right? We almost bought these off the plan properties, and then we went on to build a portfolio on the back of established properties with more land component. We've seen the results. We know that it doesn't work. Like off the plan doesn't work. I know in some markets, in a rising market, people make money with these off the plan purchases, but you really need to be aware of the risks.
But I think what's more worrying today is a lot of these sellers, agents, or marketing advisors who might even pop over to your home to talk about their products. They're disguising themselves as buyers agents. They would say, well, we are helping you buy. You don't need to pay us anything, but we are your buyers agents. But you need to be really clear and have a different point of difference between who you're working with. Are they really a buyer's agent? No, they're not a buyer's agent. They might tell you they're a buyer's agent. And often, people might say, oh, my friend bought a brand new apartment from this buyer's agent. Well, no, they are not a buyer's agent. And it's really unfortunate because recently, actually, I had a client where we got a valuation done with the bank. So it was basically these townhouses, which were being sold as houses with very close bolts with properties side by side. And the way the contracts were done they pretty much wanted everything upfront rather than a progress payment schedule. The lender did not value the property. 1, 2, they said they're not going to fund it. The security is unacceptable to them.
Yep. And we inquired with multiple lenders to see how they would take it, and they wouldn't take that contract of sale. So
yeah. So, but the client was really sold out that these people were their buyers agents, and even the selling agents, they were really keen to get it across the line. They showed me valuations from different banks, which had supposedly stacked up. But this client couldn't go to all these banks, and even these banks said they won't take it. So somehow some deals might have gotten through, but the unfortunate thing is the client couldn't see the risk they were getting themselves into, the deal they were getting themselves into over the long term.
Yep. So there's a number of risks that you need to cover off on before you even go and consider these types of properties. And we'll go through those shortly.
As we know, there's several risks that go with off-the-plan properties, and it's an important discussion we have because so many people out there need to know about this. The most important one that we've already discussed is the valuation risk. So if the bank doesn't think the property is worth that much, it really is not worth that much. And you end up overpaying for something like that.
So firstly, you can't go to every single bank, right? Depending on your circumstances. I mean, you may have a lot of options, but you may not have a lot of options. You might be limited. So if you are only able to, say, hypothetically go to one bank based on your life circumstances and that valuation comes short, then you have no backup option. What do you do then? Then does that mean you lose your deposit? And imagine if you paid the deposit for this property a year, 2 years ago, and now things are different. You can only really go to one lender. You can't even pull out of that deal, and potentially you might have to lose your deposit or arrange for more money to top up the shortfall in valuation.
If you have a lot of equity, you might be able to do that, or a lot of borrowing capacity, but more often than not, it's unsuspecting buyers who buy these properties. And the banks don't value these properties until within 3 months of settlement. And even 3 months is, I suppose, a pipe dream because the developers want you to settle these properties within 14 days of them being ready to settle. So the bank can't really value a property until you're able to, someone can physically go out to the property. And they won't rely on any desktop valuations either under most circumstances.
And adding to the complexity, some banks also have registers, security registers, where they list different buildings, and they might say, well, we do not want more exposure to this particular building because we've already lent X percentage we've already funded certain amount of properties in this particular building, and we are no longer going to lend. And if that's the only bank you can go to, then what do? Then you're really stuck. Your borrowing capacity works with this bank, but they're not willing to lend you the money.
Or they could have a high market risk noted on the valuation report and them saying, well, we might lend you, but rather than lend you the 80 or 90% you want, we'll only lend you 70% of the value of the property. And that's not just for brand new. Actually, you'll be surprised in high density areas. It still applies to established units as well, where there's been a massive oversupply. And going to oversupply part of it, why would, say, a tenant want to rent your property?
That's right. And in many of these cases, developers may provide you with rental guarantees, and they'll guarantee a certain amount of rent, which is generally above market value of what you could get if you went on an open market. So say hypothetically on an open market, you could get $500 a week, whereas the developer says, well, we'll guarantee that you will get $600 a week for a year, 2 years, 3 years. Now, the question is, what happens when the rental guarantee is up? Perhaps the rents may have caught on, but what you need to be wary of is when there's a heap of properties in a high density complex that flood the market, it might suppress rents in your property.
If it's such a good investment, why do they really need to guarantee the rent? The property should attract tenants as it is. The vacancy rate should be low enough for you to acquire tenants. And really, if they're building heaps of more units or even house and land packages in that area, a tenant has the choice to pick one up the road, a brand new one, a newer one, or even when you come to sell, why would someone buy your property versus one up the road? And they're probably being sold the same dream of that brand new property.
And most people want to gain when they invest, right? Whether they're buying their home or they're investing in a property, they want to have capital growth down the track so they could add to their wealth. But then if there is a lot of oversupply of the same type of properties in an area, then what happens, right? Capital growth is dependent on supply and demand, right? If the demand for property exceeds the supply, then you will have gains. Whereas if there's a lot of property flooding the market, if there's a lot of land, a lot of construction going on, there is a chance that your property may not grow in value.
But have you, have many people even considered that lending climates could change in this time, from the time they sign up for the property till they are ready, the developer is ready for you to settle? Could your life circumstances have changed in that time? Could lending climates have changed? Borrowing tightens, interest rates go up, lending policy changes. The bank doesn't want to buy or lend for properties in those areas.
So there's a lot of variables that you need to cover off on. And many of these you won't even know until such a time that the property is actually ready to be completed, ready to be valued. You're ready to put a loan application. So you need to really work out what could happen in the next 1, 2, 3 years until the property will be ready. And some of these, you can't preempt.
Yeah, well, at the height of the Sydney boom in the 2013 to 2017 or time frame, there were news articles where people had put deposits on a $600K apartment where they'd put 10% deposit, which is $60,000. And for some reason, the developer was no longer able to settle. And in that same time, there were properties worth $800,000. $600K turned into $800K established properties. Yes, that happens in a rising market, and that's what happened. And these people were being returned their deposits because the developer couldn't deliver on their promise. 60 grand, and they've lost 200K in capital growth. They can't even get into a same like-for-like property anymore.
So the cash lost value, right? It wasn't a real investment that they made. They put a deposit down. Nothing existed in return for that. It's not an asset. You're really pretty much giving the money to a developer just as, just to kickstart their project.
Get funding for their project. I think also the challenge is, right, if you lose your job or grow your family, life circumstances changing, how would you fund that property because, again, you can't get a formal approval until the property is ready. And I have seen clients who've come to us and they've registered a land. This is, say, in Western Sydney. They might have registered in 2016, 2017, the land in, say, they paid 10% deposit, $50,000. And come time to settle, the lending climate significantly tightened up and they could no longer service for that purchase. They've lost literally 10% deposit on these properties. They're not even getting that money back.
I think it was that period, right, where people thought, the Sydney market would keep rising and that euphoria that goes with rising markets. And they thought, okay, now we'll put a deposit on a property. Unbeknownst to them or to anybody for that matter, lending really tightened at Sydney's peak, right? Like lenders, APRA had extra regulations and these people could no longer service for these properties. And many times people may not even check their borrowing capacity before they go and put these deposits. So that's the worst, right?
That's ignorant and I would say, unfortunately, irresponsible.
But people don't get informed by the selling agent or developer. So if you're in those shoes and you are considering of the plan, then you must weigh up your risks. You must get your borrowing capacity determined. You must do all these things and be aware of the risks, especially the ones that we've discussed today, because it will put you in a better position should you decide to go down this path.
Yeah. And then we've also seen clients where they might have bought an apartment at the height of the Sydney boom, like 2016, late 2016.
In 2017, I had these clients, they put a deposit down in Western Sydney region in a high density complex, like hundreds of apartments in this complex. So this was around 2016, 2017. So that was really the peak of the Sydney market previously when we had the Sydney boom a couple of years ago. And then this property was only really handed over to them early to mid 2022.
That's
so
6
literally
years.
4 to 5 years.
6. That's 6 years.
About 6 years, really, for 5 to 6 years. And in this time, they could have gone and purchased a property, say in Brisbane, following the property cycles. They would have they would have doubled their money.
They would have spent half and doubled their money. So they could have bought 2 properties.
And I was looking so these apartments are pretty much worth what they bought them for back in 2016, 2017.
Nearly 8 years later, they're still worth what they did.
And the strata costs would be around about $1,000 to $1,100 a quarter. So that's substantial, right? So I know people need a place to live, a place to call home, but you need to really weigh up like at what stage in your life you're able to take that risk.
But these clients were quite vulnerable as well, and they really got sold out most likely on the shiny brochures, on the dream. And the dream is also the tax dream, right? We also often see people say, I want to save tax, so I'll buy brand new.
And I've had clients, who bought off the plan. This was at the peak of the previous Brisbane boom in 2009, like a brand new off the plan townhouse in an area which is primarily houses. So they bought this townhouse, they sold it recently, not that long ago, like at least it took them 13 or 14 years to sell it, and it was in the negative for the good part of those 14 years.
So they paid $360K. That was in 2009, which was peak of the Brisbane market in the last boom. And by 2020, that property was worth $250K. It's really unfortunate because we did some numbers and they could have built a multi-million-dollar portfolio had they not gotten into that property. Unfortunately, they could have bought 1,000 square meters block at that point in time in that same area. So again, hindsight is a beautiful thing. It's not your fault, but please educate yourself before you get into these deals.
And often investors are sold the dream of depreciation, and that would have been the case in this scenario, buying this $360K townhouse. So by an investors club of sorts, and depreciation is like, great, like it's a good tax benefit to have, but it's really icing on the cake. And that's how we have treated it as in our property portfolio. Our decisions aren't based on the depreciation one could get, or the numbers that we did for our own portfolio. Depreciation was really icing on the cake. With depreciation, you need to be mindful that, sure, you'll get the tax deduction. It's really a timing illusion. You'll get tax back for, say, for a few years. Then when you come to selling the property, that depreciation gets taken off your cost base. So you might have bought a property for, say, $500,000. You've claimed $50,000 worth of depreciation over your ownership period. So your cost base really becomes $500,000 minus $50,000, which is $450,000. And effectively, you'd be paying capital gains tax on that $50K. Again, it's not as simplistic as this. I would suggest you sit down with your accountant and do the figures and get a good understanding of this, because it may not benefit you long term. And the biggest price you'd pay is actually potentially not having the same level of capital growth either. You'd get that tax benefit, but you won't really make the capital gains, which actually propels a property portfolio.
That's what helps that leapfrog strategy to build a property portfolio. But unfortunately, conveniently, these things don't get a mention when you buy these properties. They don't tell you that you'll be paying tax when you come to selling that property. You might claim that benefit. You get sold that dream of saving tax, and which feels good. You might receive it back, but ultimately you'll be the one paying for it, and you've already paid for it with the opportunity cost. And most people don't even measure that.
It's an intangible, right? It's an intangible. And now we discussed earlier in this episode about a scenario of established versus brand new. What we saw with the analysis we've done in our own portfolio, for someone who would have chosen an off-the-plan path, they would have been way behind. They would not have been able to expand their portfolio.
Yeah, so please seek relevant credit, property, and tax advice before you put yourself in these sort of setups. They're not designed to do good for you. There might be a time, they may look good, right? I'm still waiting for that time, 15 years of investing. I'm still waiting for that time to arrive as to when this might appear as a good investment, and we might consider it for our own portfolios.
In a rising market, It may, but it's not always a rising market. You are dealing with a number of risks with it, because property markets ebb and flow, and there's different cycles in different cities at different points in time. So you just need to make sure you're getting in at the right time.
And why overcomplicate it? Just keep it simple and buy property.
Established.
Yes. Thanks for listening. Join us next time for another episode of Property Addicts Australia podcast.